they tortured her with an electric drill. They literally drilled holes through her hands and feet as they were torturing her. We had a case near Underberg with a farmer who was they had jig or bleach forced down his throat. There was a farmer who had a sword shoved down his throat. There were actually several cases of farmers being tied behind bakkies or pickup trucks, to use the more contemporary or the better known term, who were tied behind these vehicles with their feet, who were dragged over dirt roads until they died. We can just go on and on.
Hello, my name is Donald, and welcome to WorldView. At WorldView, we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. Today, we're talking with the land thief who calls himself Ernst Roets. Ernst is a civil rights activist, writer, and filmmaker in South Africa. He is the deputy CEO of the civil rights group AfriForum and the CEO of the film production company Forum Films. Ernst, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. It's good to be on the show. It's my first time on your show, but thank you very much for having me.
So, Ernst, in my interview with Kali Kriel, we only briefly went over the entire farm murder situation. So, but I know you've actually written a book about this. So, can you tell us how bad is the situation? Can you give us some data, statistics, stories? How bad is the farm murder situation in South Africa?
Well, it's very bad, and there are many different ways of describing it. One way is to look at the sheer brutality of the crime phenomenon, the tortures that we see, the severe levels of brutality, and the most grotesque and inhumane methods of torture imaginable. And I can mention some examples if you want. Another way of looking at it is to look at the statistics, the numbers. Now, there's a big debate about the numbers, but also it fluctuates. It goes up and down, as is the case with probably any crime phenomenon. So what I did in my book, which was published in 2018, was to try to get as close to an average as I can. I calculated the average over a period of 20 years. So over a time frame of 2 decades, there were on average 2 farm attacks per day, more or less, in South Africa. Those are the ones we know of. Of course, the real number would be much higher because there are many attacks that are never reported to the police or never reported to the media. But 2 farm attacks per day on average that we know of, and about 2 farm murders per week over that time frame. Now, there was a decline about 5 years or so ago, maybe a little bit more, and then more or less, up until about 5 years ago, and then it started increasing again. So we have been experiencing an increase, and what's really interesting is during the hard lockdown last year, there was a time where there was no farm murders and virtually no farm attacks. And when the hard lockdown ended, what we saw was a skyrocketing of the numbers. To such an extent that at the end of the year, we were back to what could have been anticipated for the year, even if there would not have been a lockdown.
Okay, but I know, and it's specific in the case of farm murders, these people are being tortured. I mean, they're not just being killed, they're being tortured. Okay, can you tell us some of those stories of how these people are tortured?
Yes, it's so bad that you wouldn't believe it if you don't actually speak to the victims. There's a case that's still pending at the moment. It hasn't been settled. I think next month will be a next hearing. I think the murder happened in 2016, and it was an attack on a farm near Dullstroom with Robert Lynn and Sue Howarth. For example, Robert was tied to a chair, and they tortured him with a blowtorch. Sue Howarth was shot, but she was still alive. She was then dragged behind a vehicle over dirt roads. She was severely beaten. Eventually, she was shot in the eye, and she survived. but she was in a coma, and she died later in hospital. We've had the case of Nikki Simpson, for example, near Fochville, who was also pushed down into a chair. They tortured her with an electric drill. They literally drilled holes through her hands and feet as they were torturing her. We had a case near Underberg with a farmer who was they had jig or bleach forced down his throat. There was a farmer who had a sword shoved down his throat. There were actually several cases of farmers being tied behind bakkies or pickup trucks, to use the more contemporary or the better known term, who were tied behind these vehicles with their feet, who were dragged over dirt roads until they died. We can just go on and on. Little children being killed. The story of Wilmien Potgieter, who had to witness her. She was 3 years old. She had to witness as they murdered her father, Ati Potgieter, by stabbing him 151 times with a garden fork and a machete and a knife. And the list just goes on and on. People being burned to death. We've had cases of people being drowned. The Solaks, for example, their hands were tied behind their back. They had pillowcases pulled over their heads, and they were then thrown off a bridge into a river, and they died. We had examples of farmers who were killed by having them thrown in a hot tub, for example, filled with boiling water. In one case, the shower nozzle was forced down the farmer's throat, and the hot water tap was opened to such an extent that the post-mortem revealed that his organs was burnt white from the inside. I mean, I can just go on and on. We've had examples of people who had their eyes gouged out. We've had especially women who were raped, who were mutilated, whose breasts were cut off, whose private parts were mutilated during the attacks. It's just, if you have to start, with a list, we've had people who had limbs removed. It's just absolutely crazy. The fact that these things just go on and on and on, and I can keep going. The examples of how people have been tortured during these attacks.
Yeah, just quickly, the blowtorch, was it held against the face? How did he torture someone with the blowtorch?
No, it was he was burnt all over his body, not his face. So his legs and arms and his chest and so forth. They also suffocated him. They rolled him up in a I think a carpet, like a blanket, and to such an extent that he wasn't able to breathe. It's just unimaginable.
And how long did that take before he died?
He actually survived. His wife was killed. Robert Lynn, he's an Irish national. He moved back to Ireland. The criminal case is still pending, and it happened several years ago. So there hasn't been justice for his wife, Sue. So he was lucky to have survived the attack, but his wife wasn't. She was the one who was dragged behind the vehicle and who was eventually shot. They close range. They actually held the gun up to her eye, and they pulled the trigger. But she survived that. And then, as I said, she eventually died in the hospital. Yeah,
I mean, that's terrible. I can just imagine the trauma of that experience. But these events, are they confined to one particular province? Is there some provinces that you see this more than another province? So, for example, is the Western Cape a bit... you don't really see a lot of farm murders in the Western Cape, for example.
Yeah, well, in the last few years, there were some high-profile farm murders in the Western Cape. I would say the only province in which there aren't really that many farm murders is the Northern Cape. It differs between the provinces in terms of which one is in the lead. It also in the lead in terms of the most farm murders and farm attacks. It also depends on whether you include small holdings in the data. If you do, then Gauteng is by far the province with the most farm attacks. If you exclude small holdings, Gauteng is still to a large extent. And Limpopo is a very dangerous province. KwaZulu-Natal is very dangerous. Mpumalanga, Northwest, Free State also has a lot. So it's pretty much spread out all over the country with, as I said, the least in the Northern Cape.
Can these attacks in general be classified as a genocide? I know this is a controversial question, but I think you know the answer to this. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
No. Well, it is a controversial question, as you say, and there's some serious debates and disagreements about this. Our position is that these attacks do not constitute genocide for the simple reason that there's a very particular definition for what constitutes genocide. And if you're talking about farm murders, it doesn't comply with that definition. Farm murders is a murder or a crime phenomenon that targets a particular profession, you could say. It's not targeting an ethnic group like Afrikaners or a racial group like white people, yes, by implication as well. But to say that it's genocide against white people is, it has you have to conclude that a significant proportion of the white population of South Africa have been murdered or is being murdered as a result of farm murders. And the fact is that a very, very small percentage of the white population, if you want to use race, actually live on farms or are farmers. There are about more than 3 million white people in South Africa. There are about 30,000 commercial farmers. So if it's a very, very serious problem. But if you want to use the term genocide, it becomes a debate about definitions and what is the actual definition of genocide. And to say that it doesn't comply with the definition of genocide does not mean that it isn't a very, very serious problem.
Well, on that note, I know a person like Julius Malema would say, but Ernst, why are you only focusing on farm murders? Crime in general is a massive problem in South Africa. So why should we only focus on farm murders and not talk about all the people being killed in townships, for example?
Yeah, well, the fact is that we should talk about people being killed in townships as well. We're not. The argument is that when we talk about farm murders, we think farmers deserve special treatment, or when a farmer is murdered, it's more unacceptable than when a black person in a township is murdered. That's the accusation. We're not calling for special treatment for farmers. We're calling for equal treatment. And what we mean by that is, in South Africa, there are many crimes that are regarded by the South African government as priority crimes. And what that means is that the government recognizes that this is a unique crime phenomenon. It doesn't mean that the victims are more important than victims of other crimes, but that this particular crime phenomenon is unique in the way it manifests, in terms of the numbers, in terms of the brutality, in terms of the economic consequences, and so forth. And therefore, a particular counter strategy is developed. And we see that with many crimes. Copper cable theft is a priority crime. Cash in transit heists, rhino poaching. There's a list of such crimes. But the moment you talk about farm murders, the argument is suddenly, no, well, remember, all victims of crime are important. No one is saying, when you talk about rhino poaching, well, what about the elephants? Elephant poaching is also a reality. Of course it is, and it's also a problem. But there's a uniqueness surrounding rhino poaching, the same way there's a uniqueness surrounding farm murders. And one of the unique aspects of farm murders is also one of the most shocking aspects, and that is that it is a crime phenomenon that is actively encouraged, you could say, in terms of creating a particular climate by politicians. In the songs they sing, "Kill the Boer, kill the farmer," is still regularly sung. We have a court case, a hate speech case coming up against the EFF I believe in February, for them singing "Kill the Boer, kill the farmer" at the murder trial for the people who are accused of murder for murdering Brendan Horner in Senekal. So it's in terms of the songs that are sung by politicians, it's in terms of the speeches, it's in terms of politicians justifying this phenomenon, who would say, for example, oh yes, well, the reason why we have farm murders is because the farmers abuse their workers. So it's blaming the victims. But you don't see that with other crimes. You don't see people saying, oh yeah, well, the reason why gang-related violence is a problem is because these people who are being targeted by the gangs were they were sort of looking for trouble. Or you don't hear politicians saying, yes, well, when we talk about violence against women, yes, it's actually because it's the women's fault that they are raped. You don't hear that. But when you talk about farm murders, that's the narrative. So it is a unique crime phenomenon, and it's something that should be taken seriously.
Well, I'm going to play devil's advocate because I know they're probably going to argue this in court, and they're going to say, but kill the Boer, that's just, you're taking it too literally. I mean, it's just a song way back. It's just there to inspire people. It's not really there to kill people.
Yeah, that's the argument. The argument is that it's part of the ANC's heritage, although this is the EFF singing it, which makes their argument a bit weaker. And the argument is it's a song about the struggle against the apartheid system, which ended 30 years ago. And that's what Malema and the ANC argued in court in 2011 when we had the Shoot the Boer court case, or the Dubula Ibunu court case. And eventually that argument was thrown out. The question of whether it's hate speech is not so much, it's not really, well, is this part of your heritage or not? The question is, what's the definition of hate speech? And it must be hurtful and harmful, and it must incite violence or propagate hatred based on a variety of criteria, which include gender, ethnicity, race, religion, and so forth. So to make it, to simplify, the definition of hate speech is when you target people based on their identity, such as their skin color or their ethnic background or religion. You target people based on their identity, and the words you utter or your speech is a propagation of hatred that is hurtful, harmful, and an incitement to cause harm. And if it's a combination of that, then it's hate speech. Hate speech is not something that's offensive or something like that. But when you actively target people and you encourage people to inflict harm upon people based on their identity.
Just quickly, if the government were to prioritize farm murders, what would be different? What would change if they were to do that?
Well, that's an important question because we know that there's a very serious problem with the South African Police Service, and we mustn't be naive about that, to such an extent that the National Police Commissioner, I believe 2 or 3 years ago, when he spoke in Parliament, he literally said that the South African Police Service does not have the, I don't think he used the word competency, I think he used the word capacity, that the South African Police Service does not have the capacity to fulfill its constitutional mandate to keep people safe. And if the police commissioner himself says, listen, our job is to keep people safe, but we can't do it, then you know we have a problem. But if the question is what does it mean in practice if a crime like farm murders is a priority crime, essentially what it means is that it must be recognized as a unique crime phenomenon and there must be a unique counter strategy. But what that counter strategy could mean when we talk about farm murders is it could mean that it becomes a priority of the hawks, for example, that legislation be adopted in terms of which there are harsher punishments for farm attackers or farm murderers, in terms of which propagation of farm murders or incitement of farm murders or romanticizing of violence towards farmers is regarded a crime, and not just hate speech, because hate speech is a civil issue. It's not a criminal issue. There should be specialist rural safety units within the police to look into this. There should be a central authority that investigates these matters, because what happens now is each police station just responds to farm murders or farm attacks when they happen. There's not really a central office that is tasked to investigate these crimes from a bigger picture perspective, to try to really understand why are these things happening, what these attacks happening, and what can we do to prevent them from happening. That there's nothing like that. It also includes that there should be more comprehensive research done by government. They should appoint competent people to investigate this, task teams and so forth, to come forth with solutions. It should include annual or probably quarterly, we would say quarterly release of statistics by the police to say these are the latest statistics and this is what we can do about it, and an analysis of these statistics. It should include partnership between the police and civil society, particularly neighborhood watches, farm watches, and so forth. So there's a long list of practical things that could be done on ground level that just aren't happening because it's because they don't take this crime phenomenon seriously.
Well, that's a pity. Well, you mentioned earlier that the government is complicit in a certain sense with some of these farm murders. Can you give us some examples of that, or our political parties are complicit? I know there's probably one specific political party that's very complicit, in these?
Yeah, I would say there's at least two: the ruling party and the EFF, and that's the main argument of my book, Kill the Boer, is that the South African government is complicit to these attacks and why they are complicit. And there's a variety of reasons why they are complicit. When I say complicit, I'm not saying that it's government officials going out, committing the killings, although that also happens. There has been cases of such attacks committed by police officers. We have seen that. But when we say the government is complicit, we're not saying there's a big, grand, central government plan to eradicate the farmers. We're saying that the South African government is not even tacitly, but actively fostering and encouraging a political climate in which violence towards farmers is romanticized, is regarded as less condemnable. So if you haven't, and there's a chapter in my book about that, where we looked at several thousand incidents of violence on farms. And we also looked at how does the media respond, which is very interesting. And what we found was that the single biggest determining factor on how the media responds, but also the government, your question is about the government, is the race of the perpetrator, not the race of the victim, the race of the perpetrator. So if a black person kills another black person on a farm, it's not really newsworthy. We don't hear about that, although that happens regularly. If a black person kills a white person on a farm, it's also, you would hear about that, but it's also not that newsworthy. In other words, it's a farm attack. But if a white person kills a white person on a farm, it's massive news. We've seen that with Griquastad and some other examples. Or even worse, if a white person murders a black person on a farm, then you have a national spectacle for several months or even for a year. We've seen, for example, what happened with the Parys case. So there's, just to get back to your question about why is government complicit, it's because of double standards. It's because of a climate in which these things are romanticized. It's because of a lack of response by the South African government. It's because they don't respond to concerns by, not only by AfriForum, even by the victim. There was an incident at the police headquarters where a victim of a farm attack, who was attacked on a farm, who was tied up, whose husband was murdered in front of her, she wanted to hand over a memorandum just at reception. She even conceded that the minister of police or the police commissioner wouldn't come down to accept the memorandum. She literally just wanted to hand it over at reception. And they violently shoved her out of the police headquarters. They physically shoved her out. It's on video, actually. I was there. We were there when it happened. So yeah, there's a variety of things where to which you can pinpoint to say that the South African government is complicit to the problem. And if they really took the problem seriously, then we wouldn't have been in the situation where we are.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Julius Malema, there was an incident where Julius Malema visited a person in prison who subsequently he went out to murder a farmer. And a person asked Julius Malema, I believe on Twitter, did you encourage him to do that? And Julius Malema responded, I might be paraphrasing, he said, maybe I did, maybe I didn't. I mean, I find that completely deplorable. That's probably the worst thing he has ever done.
Yeah, so that's actually two different stories. The one is people, there was a particular incident and people tweeted out to Malema and someone said to him, people are saying that you are behind farm murders. And then he responded and he said, maybe not. The other incident is something that was actually aired on Carte Blanche. When I said it, it was very controversial and people accused me of lying and making up stuff. And then I actually just pointed them to the recording that was aired on Carte Blanche, and then the whole thing sort of settled down, where a person from, I think it was the 28 gang, one of these prison gangs, a general or a leader in one of these gangs, spoke with a journalist. I believe it was a journalist, not only a police official. And the recording, the discussion was recorded, and he said that Julius Malema came to see them in prison and said to them that if they want to go out and kill farmers, he can help them and he will be able to make sure that they get firearms to do so. And, it sounds very conspiratorial, but the actual audio recording of that was played. It was aired on Carte Blanche. People can find it online. And it was about a year or so before my book came out. And when I mentioned it, I was accused of, making up conspiracy theories and stuff like that. As I said, until I pointed the journalist in question to the actual Carte Blanche episode where the whole thing was aired. And then, they sort of back down. But what is so the story is alarming. And yes, it could be true that this guy is just trying to get attention and making up stuff and falsely trying to involve Malema. That could be the case. But what is alarming is that it hasn't been investigated. It wasn't a national spectacle. It was on Carte Blanche, yes. And basically nothing happened. So imagine if someone comes out and says, that if some white murderer comes out of prison and he says, oh, well, you know what, someone from AfriForum came to see me in prison and they told me I must go out and kill black people and they're going to give me firearms to do that. It would be an international spectacle if that happened. But when it's Malema, or when it's the other way around, when the victims are farmers, then it's in the news and it's in the news for 2 days and everyone forgets about it. And it goes back to the whole thing about the double standards, where the race of the perpetrator is the main determining factor in terms of how people respond. And that's not just, it's not an hypothesis, it's based on actual research, based on which you can say, well, it's very clear that the race of the victim or the race of the perpetrator is the criteria or variable, the most significant variable that according to which you can predict how this issue would be responded to by the media and by the public at large and by the government.
Why do you think they haven't investigated that? Because, I mean, I can believe a person like Ramaphosa, he would look for a silver bullet to get rid of Malema. I mean, Malema's probably his chief opponent at the moment in political elections. So why wouldn't they try to use that against him?
Well, I think there are probably many reasons, but two, which I would say are the most important. The one is that I think, in terms of your question, I think the ANC and Ramaphosa in particular is not trying to eliminate or pacify the EFF. They're trying to appease the EFF, and they're allowing the EFF to be the tail that wags the dog. They want Malema to go back to the ANC. They want the EFF to join the ANC, so they wouldn't try to destroy the EFF. That's the one reason. The other reason why I think there wasn't this massive backlash is just because it doesn't fit the narrative. The narrative is one that says or teaches us that South Africa was a lovely Garden of Eden type of place until 1652. Then the whites came, and then it was hell on earth until 1994. And then, we were all freed by the ANC, and now there are some minor glitches along the way, but basically we're all free and happy. That's the mainstream narrative. And to say, well, there's a very serious problem with farmers being murdered goes against the narrative. And I think that's why people those who are in positions of power to do something about this don't want to, because it doesn't suit their agenda, because their agenda is to keep the narrative intact.
That's fascinating. So you could sort of argue that the EFF is there just to pick up the votes the ANC is losing, and hopefully they can join again one day to pursue their agenda. But
yeah, well, no, I think that's the EFF's plan and the ANC's plan. And I'm not just saying that, I'm not just speculating, that's what they've said. I think Malema's plan is to build the EFF to be so strong that the ANC cannot ignore it, and to then come with a demand to say, okay, well, I think his move would be that he would say, we'll join the ANC, but you need to make me deputy president. I'm convinced. No one told me that, but that would have been my move if I was him. And the others, and Ramaphosa has said it himself also, and it was a few years ago, 2-3 years ago, also particularly alarming. Julius Malema made a speech, it was election year, and he said that we need to slit the throat of whiteness. And then 2 days later, Ramaphosa said, we can see that Julius Malema is still ANC deep down in his heart, and we invite him to come back to the party. After saying that, so yeah, they want him to go back to the ANC, and he wants to go back. The question is just what would be the terms. It's a bargaining, it's a political power power play that they're busy with.
Just to come back to your point of double standards, I believe you should know who advocate Mark Oppenheimer is. And he has told me, just imagine if a person has said, I want to slit the throat of whiteness, the backlash you would see then. I mean, it's clearly a double standard. Well, excuse me, blackness. Yeah, blackness.
Yeah.
That you clearly see the double standard there. That would never be accepted. But to our viewers...
Sorry, just to give you another example is the Human Rights Commission. When Malema said, we're not calling for the slaughter of white people, at least for now, he was taken to the Human Rights Commission. The Human Rights Commission investigated and issued or published their finding. And they actually said in their finding that what Malema said is not hate speech because he's black. That's literally what the Human Rights Commission said. They said, because you have to consider context and all of that. And part of the context here is that he's black. And that means that a different standard has to apply. So it's not even sort of below the surface or tacit double standard. It's active and very public double standards. The Human Rights Commission have said we need to implement double standards when we look at things like hate speech. It's very, very alarming. And we've said to the Human Rights Commission and to the media that as long as the Human Rights Commission's position is that the race of a person determines whether what he said is hate speech or not, as long as the Human Rights Commission says that, that just means that you cannot take the Human Rights Commission seriously, and the Human Rights Commission is part of the problem. It's not part of the solution.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I mean, it's not just between black or white people. I mean, there are Indians in South Africa, there are coloreds in South Africa. I mean, that you can't have that mindset. But to our viewers, Ernst, people would like to know the profile, if we come back to the farm murders, the profile of these people committing these murders. Like, for example, are they drug addicts? Are they alcoholics? Do they vote for a certain party? Where do these people come from? Because I don't suspect that these people would just be on the farm naturally and they just decide, okay, I want to kill the owner now. So where do these people come from that commit these murders?
Yeah, well, it's the most important running feature is that it's young people, teenagers or people in their 20s. You rarely find people older than 30 or let's say 40 committing these attacks. It's almost always young people. They almost always work in groups, sometimes group as big as 11 people. We find that a significant amount of them are foreigners from foreign countries. We find that very few of them, in very few of these cases, do they actually know the victims. In other words, in most of these cases, or the victims would say that where their victim survived, they would say they didn't recognize the attackers. They don't know who they were, which also sort of is a very important point to mention, because the accusation is that it's the workers killing the farmers who are just abusing them. But in the majority of the cases, they don't even recognize them. And I don't think there's really been a study about political party affiliation or something like that. So if that's the question, we can speculate. What we do know is that in some of these cases, quite a few, I can mention a few examples, the attackers chant political slogans while attacking the people. There was a guy who was attacked while his attackers were chanting, die apartheid, die white man, viva Malema. And we've had cases where the attackers would say, apartheid is over, now it's our turn. And we've had, there was a guy called Ntutuko Chwene who testified under oath, who said that he was influenced by the song, Kill the Boer, Kill the Farmer. The fact that he said that doesn't deter the ANC from singing the song. But this farm murderer says, I was influenced by this song to murder that person. I didn't have anything against him in particular. He was just at the wrong place at the wrong time. And I killed him because he's white and because I was influenced by this song. And still they keep singing it. There was a guy called Knowledge Mandlazi around Brits who was convicted of having murdered 5 people, committed 5 farm murders, who said that he said in court, my hatred for white people made me do it. And he said that for him, murdering white people is like going to work. So there is a political undertone. In the majority of cases, there's not evidence of that. In other words, there's not evidence of people chanting slogans or things like that. But there are enough such examples that we should at least be very concerned about the political undertone when it comes to this phenomenon.
That's fascinating. So why would a foreigner, or many of these foreigners, why would they have that hatred towards white people?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think we can only speculate. I think part of the reason is the left-wing explanation carries carries some merit, and that's that unemployment and poverty and inequality does play a role. We probably wouldn't have had the crisis to the same extent if everyone was wealthy and if everyone had a job. The problem is that it's not necessarily the farmer's fault if people are unemployed. We should look to government and government policies and ask the question why people are unemployed. But we do have a massive unemployment crisis. And we do know, and this is me speculating, we do know that foreigners, especially sometimes in some cases, they find it hard to find a job, or they would be targeted for when they find a job. So I would speculate that foreigners have a unique set of frustrations in South Africa, and that might contribute. We also find that with the cases where foreigners are involved is also in the cases that are closer to the borders. So you don't find cases of foreigners committing farm attacks in the Eastern Cape, for example, but you would find it in Limpopo and the northern parts of KwaZulu-Natal and so forth.
And probably also because you're a foreigner and you're not that exposed to white people, because obviously there's not as much white people in the rest of Africa as there is in South Africa. It's easy to portray or see a white person as a sort of a demon if you've never spoken to him or had contact with him.
Yeah, it could be that. But my experience, I've traveled up to, Botswana, Zambia, Malawi, Zimbabwe. And my experience speaking with foreigners there is that they were very friendly. I felt completely safe walking around in townships and interacting with people. It's a strange phenomenon where you feel at risk until you cross the Limpopo River in a way. And then when you reach, in Zimbabwe, if you interact with government officials, they would be very intimidating or try to be intimidating and corrupt and all of that. But if you just talk with ordinary people, you don't experience hostility. So I'm not sure why there's this phenomenon of foreigners. It's not as if it's exclusively foreigners committing these murders, but they do constitute a significant amount of the cases.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I've been to Namibia and Rwanda, and it's they extremely nice people. I'm just also trying to make sense of why a foreigner would have this perception. But so I, for example, have farmer family members living in the Eastern Cape, and they would wonder, okay, but the police is never going to protect me. What can I do as a farmer practically to defend myself in the case of a farm attack? What are some practical examples that you would perhaps recommend? How can I protect myself in the case of a farm attack or prevent a farm attack from happening?
Yes, well, there's a long list of really practical stuff that you can do or should do if you live on a farm. We actually developed a checklist, which we call Beveilige Plaas or Safeguard a Farm, which we are rolling out in areas where we have branches and community safety structures and so forth. And it includes having dogs inside the house particularly, and also smaller dogs serve as a very good alarm. Having people on the property, in other words, a bigger family is better than some person living there alone. Having, the standard security stuff, such as an alarm system, and making it as difficult as possible for people to get into the farm. Having good relations with your neighbors, with people in the area, with your workers. All of these things are important. But the most important thing is to be part of a community safety structure. And that's not necessarily a police structure. It's the community getting together saying, listen, we need to look after our own safety. We need to drive patrols. We need to make sure that we have contact with each other, that we interact with each other, that we are visibly patrolling the area. That's the single most important thing that people should be doing, is they should be connected, as opposed to isolated or disengaged.
So, Ernst, pivoting, I know AfriForum, you and Kali Krill, you went on a trip to the United States, and it was quite a controversial period where you met. I'm blanking on the name. The guy from Fox News.
Okay, Carlson.
Tucker Carlson. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
And he said, and in this video, that the ANC has now changed the constitution to steal land from white people. And as far as I know, that hasn't happened yet. So was that misrepresented? Did Fox News get a bit overboard? Is there something I'm missing here?
It wasn't. That's one of the things that was really annoying to me is people responding to that interview, accusing Tucker Carlson of lying and accusing me of not pointing out his lies. When what he did, if you watch the interview, is he framed it as a question. He said, so this is what's happening in South Africa. And then he asked, is this what I've just said? Is this an accurate description of what is happening in South Africa? So he posed it as a question, not as a statement. He made a statement and then he asked, is this statement accurate? And I responded by saying that there is a process. There is still a process that is to be followed for the constitution to be changed. So it's made up to be a bit of a spectacle. And it's very interesting, the American news media phenomenon, how what they regard as conservative and what they regard as liberal, how their media outlets are trying to sort of, neutralize each other or eliminate each other by pointing out, oh, this news outlet is lying, you should rather watch our news network. But what's even more alarming is what happened with that trip and during other trips we took to the US, when South African journalists who tried to convince us that they are journalists but who are actually activists would, for example, call American journalists who they know, and they would tell them these atrocious false stories about AfriForum. And then those journalists would try to find out who are we going to meet with. So I remember in one case, we had a meeting set up with a particular senator, and this journalist from South Africa sort of figured that out, called his friends in Washington, who was very much involved with news politics, not a neutral journalist, who then called the office of this senator and said, oh, we heard that you guys are going to meet with these far-right extremists from South Africa. What's your comment? So we find that journalists, not all, but some, a small minority, and unfortunately, oftentimes it's the most influential or senior journalists, are actively trying to discredit us, are actively not trying to report the news, but actively trying to prevent meetings from happening and things like that. And we've had, not often, once or twice, we've actually had meetings cancelled because of that. And it's very, very alarming. And we know who these journalists are because the journalists in Washington told us, oh, well, we got a phone call from this guy in Pretoria. So it's very alarming that we have journalists trying to convince us that they are just neutral journalists trying to present the news, when in fact they have a very particular agenda and they are actively trying to promote that agenda. And if there's a narrative that isn't aligned with their agenda, then they are actively trying to suppress that or prevent meetings from happening about this and so forth. So we should be the media, unfortunately, the mainstream media has a very bad reputation, and I'm sorry to say, but it's a bad reputation that they deserve. I'm not saying everyone in the media, obviously not. The majority of people in the media are really there for good reasons, but there are some people, especially editors, news editors, deputy editors, and so forth, who are not journalists, who are activists, masquerading as journalists.
Yeah, well, I was referencing two videos that Tucker Carlson did. There was one where he did a monologue, and there was one where he spoke to you directly. And I know, for example, that in the one where he spoke to you directly, it was more calm. Perhaps that's a correct word. But in the monologue, he was quite aggressive, and I think he overstated the case. But anyway, I think that's anyway like water under the bridge by now. But do you know who's Ben Shapiro?
Yeah.
Have you seen the pyramid that Google has discussed? The pyramid where you are mentioned. What is your opinion of that?
Well, it's silly. I actually didn't make a big fuss about the pyramid. I know the origin of it's a pyramid that was drafted by someone in South Africa. That's why I'm on the pyramid. And they were able to sort of spread it around and get it under the attention of certain people. I would even say some of these left-wing loonies in America who, and these type of people seem to get access to providing training and these, diversity studies or critical race theory or whatever you want to call it. And so somehow that ended up at Google, where someone made a presentation about whiteness and white supremacy or whatever. And this pyramid was part of the training course. So I thought it was a bit funny, although it's very serious. It is a serious topic, but it's a bit strange that something like that would be developed, in South Africa by some guy or woman who lives, in his or her, apartment, really disconnected from the world, using his own Photoshop, making this pyramid. And a few months later, it's part of a Google training course. So yeah, it's very alarming. It's obviously bogus, the whole thing. And, I just laughed it off.
What's probably happening here is critical race theory, which is dominant in the United States and Europe. Is it really relevant in a country like South Africa? I mean, it doesn't really apply. And white people are definitely, to a certain degree, being persecuted. So if critical race theory is almost like a religion, you have to somehow get rid of this idea that white people are not experiencing the greatness in South Africa. You have to. That's why, for example, it would end up in Google. You have to tarnish that idea in a sort of religious sense.
Yeah. No, there's most definitely religious undertones to the whole thing. That's unquestionable. And yeah, well, there's an interesting relationship between South Africa and the USA when it comes to the race issue, critical race theory. There's some comparisons and there's some links. For example, one of the comparisons is in the US, Martin Luther King was sort of the big champion of for the cause for Black people. And in South Africa, it was Nelson Mandela. And now we've reached the point where in South Africa, activists or you could say Black nationalists, or however you want to describe it, are dismissing Mandela, saying, no, he was a traitor. And you hear this thing more and more. People who didn't live at the time, who are youngsters now, who are sort of actively against Mandela for being too soft on white people. And you have the same thing in America, where people are rejecting Martin Luther King, especially this whole thing that you should treat people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. This is being rejected now. And in America, people now look to more radicals like Malcolm X or whoever. And in South Africa as well, or they would look to philosophers like Frans Fanon, who wrote The Wretched of the Earth and Black Skins, White Masks. So we find that. And then there's another interesting thing is the activists in South Africa get their, I'm oversimplifying, but I think there's something to be said here, that they get their ideological cues from America, especially American professors and American philosophers. A lot of it comes from there. These leftists at universities in America, they would say things, and then in South Africa, they would just pick it up and they would just copy and paste the argument. So they would say white people have all the power, where in America, maybe you could make some form of an argument because the majority is actually white, although it's a small majority. In South Africa, whites are 8% of the population. So it's a bit difficult to say that, white people have all the power when you live in a country with a Black president and a Black deputy president and a majority Black parliament, and you can go down the list. Black judges, Black police commissioner, and now you say, no, whites have all the power. So that's the one thing. And the other thing that's interesting that sort of goes the other way around is the influence that South Africa has on the US. For example, the Rhodes Must Fall campaign started in South Africa when that guy was a Chumani Matwele, if I remember, who threw feces at the statue. And then they started vandalizing statues and things. And it's something that started in South Africa that then spilled over to places like England, to places like the US in particular. So that sort of originated here and then it went overseas. The other thing that sort of originated, I don't know if it originated here, but that is a significant feature of South African politics or the breakdown of South African society is the looting. With what we saw now with the Zuma riots, if you can call it that, is wealthy people with Mercedes Benzes taking part, running into shops, stealing TVs and running out, all under the banner of fighting racism or fighting some political force. That also, again, I don't know if it started here, but it's very significant. It's a significant feature of South African politics, and it spilled over to the US, where we saw the same type of thing happening last year with these Black Lives Matter groups doing the same thing. So there's an interesting relationship between South Africa and America when it comes to the whole issue of critical race theory.
Definitely. And coming back to the Rhodes must fall event, that's something I never really understood. I think Rhodes said something along the lines of black people are apes or baboons. I might get cancelled for this opinion, but by proving him wrong, I'm going to throw my feces at the statue. I mean, that's counterintuitive in a certain way. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, and if you really wanted to protest Rhodes, then you shouldn't have gone to a university that was built with his money and that's named after him. So, I mean, you can fight racism, and obviously I'm not a fan of Cecil John Rhodes. My grandfather or great-grandfather fought in the Anglo-Boer War against the British, against Cecil John Rhodes and his ideas, you could say. So I'm not a fan of Cecil John Rhodes. When I walked past his statue back when it was still there, I didn't experience a sense of pride seeing it, or I didn't experience, awe at the magnificence of this man. In a sense, I did experience a sense of respect for the mere fact that this is someone who had a very significant influence on history. I disagree with what he did, and I think he caused a lot of suffering. His ideas caused a lot of suffering, but it's someone who really he made a stamp on history, and you can respect that even if you despise the person. But despite that, and despite my strong feelings about at least the history, I don't have animosity towards the British, but I do have, historically, I do, you could say, because my ancestors fought in the Anglo-Boer War. But I didn't read the news about this guy vandalizing the statue, saying, "Oh well, fantastic," because Cecil John Rhodes was an idiot anyway. It's just, what do you achieve by doing that? You don't achieve anything. You're not improving anyone's lives. It's just an excuse to commit crime and violence. That's all it is.
And it seems on that note, the protests and the mismanagement we are seeing, especially in Africa, is the result of pure democracy. We're seeing, if we go that route, there's a problem there. I mean, we saw the problems of aristocracy and monarchies during the medieval ages, and now we're seeing the problems of pure democracy. So it seems there's an argument to be made. We have to follow a sort of a middle route. The Republic, as it was, the United States was like a few years or 100 years back. So how would you change the South African system to get a balance between the two?
Yeah, well, the problem with let me answer your question like this. Yesterday, I read, I actually have the book here, Alexis de Tocqueville's book on the old regime and the revolution, who was the French, you could call him philosopher, who wrote about the French Revolution. And he said he was a big fan of democracy. And he was, in a way, a fan of what they wanted to achieve with the French Revolution. And he was also a fierce opponent of the old regime in France before the revolution. He criticized Burke for criticizing the revolution, when Burke basically sort of defended the old regime in a way. And the Tocqueville said, no, we had to get a better system. And there's a parallel with that in South Africa. You can say, listen, there's no point in trying to defend the old regime or trying to say we need to go back to it. That system should have ended, and it's good that we're past that. We need something better. And then what Tocqueville said is the revolution was a massive failure. And now, again, you can draw the parallel between that and South Africa and 1994. So he said the revolution was a massive failure. And what it led to was something that is equally or perhaps even more despotic than the previous regime. And the reason why he said that is he said that the new system is massively centralized. It's not decentralized. It's not really, people don't have political liberty. The idea of voting isn't political liberty. People don't have liberty. People, he said part of the problem is that in France, after the revolution, there was a much stronger emphasis on equality than on liberty. And oftentimes in practice, these two clash, and then they opt for equality and they opt to sacrifice liberty in the name of equality. That's exactly what's happening in South Africa. We only have freedom in as far as it's not in conflict with equality. So he said it's massively centralized. It doesn't respect what liberty or freedom really means. It elevates equality above liberty to the extent where people would be willing to sacrifice liberty for equality. And in the end, it's not an efficient system. It's a system that came crashing down, and people were just as angry and upset after the new system was implemented than they were before. And there's very strong, obviously, parallels to be drawn in South Africa. And I think that's part of the problem when we talk about the type of democracy that we have in South Africa. Is it's very centralized. It's not really democracy. It's in no way. If we say that the first democracies were in Athens, then you have to sort of explain the fact that the type of government they had in Athens, in classical times, is in no way comparable or recognizable in the type of government that we have in South Africa. Why? Because it was much more local. It was much more participatory. Everyone participated. People didn't participate through representatives. There wasn't this massive central authority that made these decisions on behalf of everyone else. Everyone was involved with the decision-making process, and people had a say over things that affected their lives. And in South Africa, that's not the case. The best argument you can make is that is the case in theory, but it's definitely, I would say it's not the case in theory. But even if you concede that it is the case in theory, then it's certainly not the case in reality that people have a say over their lives in South Africa.
Probably another good example is when autocratic Tsar Russia, switched over to communism, because those two systems were so much the same. So that could have happened there.
Yeah, it's the same thing. And also it was, and maybe that's a better comparison to South Africa. And it was said that, this is what we need to free the people, to make sure that if we are finally free and equal, as if it's the same thing. And I think being free and being equal is the same thing. It just, or could be completely reconcilable or compatible. It just depends on what your definition of equality is. If your definition of equality is everyone must have, if your definition of equality is equality of outcome, then that's in no way compatible with freedom. You can only achieve that by sacrificing freedom. And that is the ANC's definition of equality. Or more particular, the ANC's definition of equality is, you could frame it more precisely to say that it's racial representativity. And in a way combined with the idea of equality of outcome. If your definition of equality is racial representativity, there's no way in which you can achieve that without sacrificing freedom, because it's not compatible with freedom.
And it seems like AfriForum is almost becoming, in the pursuit of this decentralizing the powers of South Africa, you're becoming a shadow government. I mean, you're filling potholes. It seems like eventually you're going to become a direct competitor to the South African government. Where do you see the future of AfriForum landing? Where's it going to head up?
Yeah, so I'm very curious. I actually asked the question the other day. We must do an audit, just how many potholes have AfriForum filled. And it's tens of thousands. It's not just a few hundred. It's tens of thousands of potholes. I can guarantee you that. And how many farm attackers has AfriForum arrested through our community safety structures, through our neighborhood watches? Or how many farm attacks have we prevented? Just to name two examples, how many garbage or dumping sites have we cleaned up? I mean, there's a long list. You can just go. The way to look at that, or the easy way, is to go to AfriForum's website, to then click on news and click on press statements, and just scroll down the list, and you would see a long list of stuff that we've been doing through our branches. The 90% of what AfriForum do is not the stuff that you read in the newspaper. It's stuff that we do through our branches and in local communities. But to answer your question, we don't see ourselves, we're not trying to be a shadow government. We don't see ourselves as competition for the South African government. We don't see the South African government as competition for us. We're not a political movement in the sense that we want people to vote for us. We're a civil rights group or a pressure group. We do want to achieve, we want to promote freedom in South Africa, a sustainable definition of freedom. We don't want people to leave the country. But if they do, we don't regard them as enemies or traitors. We regard them as ambassadors. But let's put it this way. It's easy to, politically speaking, it's easy to determine a strategy, a political strategy, if you have a clear definition of who your enemy is. And the truth is that AfriForum does not have an enemy. Our enemy is not the ANC. Our enemy is not the South African government. In other words, our work wouldn't be done if the ANC is out of power or if the South African government collapses. That's not our goal. We don't have an enemy in that sense. You could say our enemy is something more abstract, like apathy or something like that. That's the closest we can get to defining an enemy. But we want some sustainable form of freedom. We believe the state is the barrier. It's not the road. It's the biggest obstacle on the road to freedom. It's not the road to freedom. That's why we don't want to be the state. We don't want to be a parallel state. We believe the future, not only in South Africa, but especially in South Africa, lies outside of the realm of government. We're not anarchists. We don't want to destroy government, but we're saying that government, or let's rather say the state, is becoming more and more irrelevant and will become more irrelevant. And there will be friction, of course. It's like an injured buffalo. It's most dangerous when it's most vulnerable. And I think that's what we're going to see in South Africa with the government and the state. But so we will have some tough times ahead, but we really believe that we're ahead of the curve. We're not behind the curve. And what I mean by that is that other countries, the USA and Australia and New Zealand and Europe, especially Western Europe, are going to experience the problems that we are experiencing now. So we're not behind them, we're in front of them. And that's something that's exciting in a way. I mean, it's a dangerous country and all of that, but we're leading, we regard ourselves as leaders in this push to state-proof people, to ensure that we get past this weird place where we're in now, where our complete frame of reference is defined by the state. It's not sustainable. It's not going to be like that forever. And we believe the rest of the world, if we do this properly, we believe the rest of the world is going to learn some lessons from us in South Africa.
Well, thank you, Ernst. That's a very positive note to end up on. I see our time is running out, and I find it ironic. I don't know if you know who Rob Hershoff is. The billionaire. He recently did an interview or a monologue that went viral where he said that you should leave South Africa because there's critical race theory here. But I mean, there's critical race theory, and that's where it originated in the United States, and that's where it comes from. So I mean, yeah, to add to your point, these problems, if they didn't originate from the United States, they're going to come there. They can head there. But thank you so much for your time. I want to give you one last opportunity to add, plug, or say anything that you want to.
Well, maybe a final comment would just be on to add to what I've just said. I think there are many reasons to be pessimistic about South Africa. We often say that it's actually something that Kali Kriel has said a few times publicly, and I completely share his view on this, that he's much more optimistic now about the future than he was 20 years ago. And it sounds like a crazy thing to say, because 20 years ago, we were, just getting out of the Mandela years, and Mbeki was president, and, the economy was going up. But I think it's important that we shouldn't define, and I think that's what the libertarians do wrong, where they get it wrong, is we cannot simply define freedom in terms of economic freedom. And South Africa had a sense of economic freedom, initially, at least, when the ANC took power. Freedom is much more than that. But the reason why I'm more optimistic now is back then, the whole thing was driven by the state, and you could clearly see that it was unsustainable. It's like, also to get back to Tocqueville's comments on the French Revolution. He says that the seeds for the revolution were not planted during the reign of Louis XVI, who was the king who was eventually beheaded. The seeds of the revolution already took root during the monarchy of Louis XIV, when people generally say that was sort of the high point of the French monarchy, It wasn't ever as strong as it was under Louis XIV. But you can clearly see in his analysis that the seeds for the revolution was already sown. Yeah, exactly. The Sun King, yes. So, and I think that's in South Africa, you could say that the seeds for the collapse of what we know as South Africa was already there when Nelson Mandela was president and when Thabo Mbeki was president. It just took time for it to come to the fore. And I'm not saying this as a celebratory thing. I'm just saying it as a recognition of reality. And that does not mean that if the state collapses, it's not going to collapse entirely. But if the state loses its authority or power, it doesn't mean we're going to sink into anarchy and, we're just going to have some post-apocalyptic type of situation in South Africa. It means we're going to get back to a more natural society. And maybe I'm being utopian now or over-optimistic, but some form of a society where there's more authority in the hands of local communities to decide over things that are important to them, as opposed to authority in the state. They're not going to hand over their authority. They won't do that, but they're just going to lose their power just in reality. And that's what's busy happening in South Africa.
Well, thank you, Ernst. I think I speak for most South Africans of all races. Thank you so much for what you do and what your organization does. I mean, I might not speak for the media, but I think I speak for most South Africans. They are glad of what you are doing. And to our viewers, thank you so much. If you've made it this far, please consider liking this video, sharing this widely as possible, and subscribing to our channel. My name is Donald, and you've been watching WorldView.